Chapter 17 of A Texas Matchmaker by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Winter at Las Palomas. The winter succeeding the drought was an unusually mild one, frost and sleet being unseen at Las Palomas. After the holidays, several warm rains fell, affording fine hunting and assuring enough moisture in the soil to ensure an early spring. The preceding winter had been gloomy, but this proved to be the most social one since my advent, for within 50 miles of the ranch no less than 2 weddings occurred during Christmas week. As to little neighborhood happenings, we could hear of half a dozen every time we went to Shepherd's after the mail. When the native help of the ranch was started at blocking out the stone for the chapel, Uncle Lance took the hounds, and with 2 of the boys went down to Wilson's ranch for a hunt. Gallup went, of course, but just why he took Scales along, unless with the design of making a match between one of the younger daughters of this neighboring ranchman and the Marylander, was not entirely clear. When he wanted to, Scales could make himself very agreeable, and had it not been for his profligate disposition, his being taken along on the hunt would have been no mystery. Everyone on the ranch, including the master and mistress, were cognizant of the fact that for the past year he had maintained a correspondence with a girl in Florida, the one whose letter and photograph had been found in the box of oranges. He hardly deserved the confidence of that roguish girl, for he showed her letters to anyone who cared to read them. I had read every line of the whole correspondence, and it was plain that Scales had deceived the girl into believing that he was a prominent ranchman, when in reality the best that could be said of him was that he was a lovable vagabond. From the last letter it was clear that he had promised to marry the girl during the Christmas week just past, but had asked for a postponement on the ground that the drought had prevented him from selling his beeves. When Uncle Lance made the discovery, during a cow hunt the fall before, of the correspondence between Scales and the Florida girl, he said to us around the campfire that night, "Well, all I've got to say is that girl down in Florida is hard up. Why, it's entirely contrary to a girl's nature to want to be wooed by letter. Until the leopard changes his spots, the good old way of putting your arm around the girl and whispering that you love her will continue to be popular. If I was to hazard an opinion about that girl, Aaron, I'd say that she was ambitious to rise above her surroundings. The chances are that she wants to get away from home, and possibly she's as much displeased with the young men in the orange country as I sometimes get with you dot-rotted cowhands. Now, I'm not one of those people who's always harping about the youth of his day, and generations being so much better than the present. That's all humbug. But what does get me is that you youngsters don't profit more by the experience of an old man like me who's been married 3 times. Line upon line and precept upon precept, I have preached this thing to my boys for the last 10 years, and what has it amounted to? Not a single white bride has ever been brought to Las Palomas. They can call me a matchmaker if they want to, but the evidence is to the contrary. This was on the night after we passed Shepherd's, where Scales had received a letter from the Florida girl. But why he should accompany the hunt now to Rimanera, unless the old ranchero proposed reforming him, was too deep a problem for me. On leaving for Wilson's there was the usual bustle, hounds responding to the horn and horses under saddle champing their bits. I had hoped that permission to go over to the Frio and San Miguel would be given John and myself, but my employer's mind was too absorbed in something else, and we were overlooked in the hurry to get away. Since the quarrying of the rock had commenced, my work had been overseeing the native help, of which we had some 15 cutting and hauling. In numerous places within a mile of the headquarters, a soft porous rock cropped out. By using a crowbar with a tempered chisel point, the Mexicans easily channeled the rock into blocks, 18 by 30 inches, splitting each stone a foot in thickness, so that when hauled to the place of use, each piece was ready to lay up in the wall. The ranch house at headquarters was built out of this rock, and where permanency was required, it was the best material available, whitening and apparently becoming firmer with time and exposure. I had not seen my sweetheart in nearly a month, but there I was, chained to a rock quarry and mule teams. The very idea of Gallup and the profligate Scales, riding the hounds and basking in the society of charming girls, nettled me. The remainder of the ranch outfit was under Deweese, building the new corrals, so that I never heard my own tongue spoken except at meals and about the house. My orders included the cutting of a few hundred rock extra above the needs of the chapel, and when this got noised among the help, I had to explain that there was some talk of building a stone cottage, and intimated that it was for Juana and Fidel. But that lucky rascal was one of the crew cutting rock, and from some source or other he had learned that I was liable to need a cottage at Las Palomas in the near future. The fact that I was acting segundo over the quarrying outfit was taken advantage of by Fidel to clear his skirts and charge the extra rock to my matrimonial expectations. He was a fast workman, and on every stone he split from the mother ledge he sang out, "Otro piedra por Don Thomas," and within a few minutes' time someone else would cry out, "Otro silar por Fidel y Juana," or "Otro piedra por Padre Norquin." A week passed, and there was no return of the hunters. We had so systematized our work at the quarry that my presence was hardly needed, so every evening I urged Cotton to sound the mistress for permission to visit our sweethearts. John was a good-natured fellow who could be easily led or pushed forward, and I had come to look upon Miss Jean as a ready supporter of any of her brother's projects. For that reason her permission was as good as the master's. But she parried all Cotton's hints, pleading the neglect of our work in the absence of her brother. I was disgusted with the monotony of quarry work, and likewise was John over building corrals, as no cowhand ever enthuses over manual labor, when an incident occurred which afforded the opportunity desired. The mistress needed some small articles from the store at Shepherd's, and a Mexican boy had been sent down on this errand, and also to get the mail of the past 2 weeks. On the boy's return, he brought a message from the merchant, saying that Henry Annear had been accidentally killed by a horse that day, and that the burial would take place at 10 o'clock the next morning. The news threw the mistress of Las Palomas into a flutter. Her brother was absent, and she felt a delicacy in consulting Deweese, and very naturally turned to me for advice. Funerals in the Nueces Valley were so very rare that I advised going, even if the unfortunate man had stood not too high in our estimation. Annear lived on the divide between Shepherd's and the Frio at a ranch called Las Norias. As this ranch was not over 10 miles from the mouth of the San Miguel, the astute mind can readily see the gleam of my axe in attending. Funerals were such events that I knew to a certainty that all the countryside within reach would attend, and the Vox ranch was not over 15 miles distant from Las Norias. Acting on my advice, the mistress ordered the ambulance to be ready to start by 3 o'clock the next morning, and gave everyone on the ranch who cared permission to go along. All of us took advantage of the offer, except Deweese, who, when out of hearing of the mistress, excused himself rather profanely. The boy had returned late in the day, but we lost no time in acting on Miss Jean's orders. Fortunately, the ambulance teams were in hand hauling rock, but we rushed out several vaqueros to bring in the remuda, which contained our best saddle horses. It was after dark when they returned with the mounts wanted, and warning Tiburcio that we would call him at an early hour, every one retired for a few hours' rest. I would resent the charge that I am selfish or unsympathetic, yet before falling asleep that night, the deplorable accident was entirely overlooked in the anticipated pleasure of seeing Esther. As it was fully a 35-mile drive, we started at daybreak, and to encourage the mules, Quayle and Happersett rode in the lead until sunup, when they dropped to the rear with Cotton and myself. We did not go by way of Shepherd's, but crossed the river several miles above the ferry, following an old cotton road made during the war, from the interior of the state to Matamoros, Mexico. It was some time before the hour named for the burial when we sighted Las Norias on the divide, and spurred up the ambulance team to reach the ranch in time for the funeral. The services were conducted by a strange minister who happened to be visiting in Oakville, but what impressed me in particular was the solicitude of Miss Jean for the widow. She had been frequently entertained at Las Palomas by its mistress, as the sweetheart of June Deweese, though since her marriage to Annear a decided coolness had existed between the two women. But in the present hour of trouble, the past was forgotten, and they mingled their tears like sisters. On our return, which was to be by way of the Voxes, I joined those from the McLeod ranch, while Happersett and Cotton accompanied the ambulance to the Vox home. Nearly every one going our way was on horseback, and when the cavalcade was some distance from Las Norias, my sweetheart dropped to the rear for a confidential chat and told me that a lawyer from Corpus Christi, an old friend of the family, had come up for the purpose of taking the preliminary steps for securing her freedom, and that she expected to be relieved of the odious ties which bound her to Oxenford at the May term of the court. This was pleasant news to me, for there would be no reason for delaying our marriage. Happersett rode down to the San Miguel the next morning to inform Quayle and myself that the mistress was then on the way to spend the night with the widow Annear, and that the rest of us were to report at home the following evening. She had apparently inspected the lines on the Frio, and finding everything favorable, turned to other fields. I was disappointed, for Esther and I had planned to go up to the Vox ranch during the visit. Dan suggested that we ride home together by way of the Voxes, but Quayle bitterly refused even to go near the ranch. He felt very sore and revengeful over being jilted by Frances after she had let him crown her queen of the ball at the tournament dance. So, agreeing to meet on the divide the next day for the ride back to Las Palomas, we parted. The next afternoon, on reaching the divide between the Frio and the home river, Theodore and I scanned the horizon in vain for any horsemen. We dismounted, and after waiting nearly an hour, descried two specks to the northward, which we knew must be our men. On coming up, they also threw themselves on the ground, and we indulged in a cigarette while we compared notes. I had nothing to conceal, and frankly confessed that Esther and I expected to marry during the latter part of May. Cotton, though, seemed reticent, and though Theodore cross-questioned him rather severely, was non-committal and dumb as an oyster. But before we recrossed the Nueces that evening, John and I, having fallen far to the rear of the other two, he admitted to me that his wedding would occur within a month after Lent. It was to be a confidence between us, but I advised him to take Uncle Lance into the secret at once. But on reaching the ranch, we learned that the hunting party had not returned, nor had the mistress. The next morning we resumed our work, Quayle and Cotton at corral building, and I at rock quarry. The work had progressed during my absence, and the number of pieces desired was nearing completion, and with but one team hauling, the workshop was already congested with cut building stone. By noon the quarry was so cluttered with blocks that I ordered half the help to take axes and go up to the encinal to cut dry oak wood for burning the lime. With the remainder of my outfit, we cleaned out and sealed off the walls of an old lime kiln, which had served ever since the first rock building rose on Las Palomas. The oven was cut in the same porous formation, the interior resembling an immense jug, possibly 12 feet in diameter and 15 feet in height to the surface of the ledge. By locating the kiln near the abrupt wall of an abandoned quarry, ventilation was given from below by a connecting tunnel some 20 feet in length. Layers of wood and limestone were placed within until the interior was filled, when it was fired, and after burning for a few hours, the draft was cut off below and above, and the heat retained until the limestone was properly burned. Near the middle of the afternoon, the drivers hauling the blocks drove near the kiln and shouted that the hunters had returned. Scaling off the burnt rock in the interior and removing the debris made it late before our job was finished. Then one of the vaqueros working on the outside told us that the ambulance had crossed the river over an hour before and was then in the ranch. This was good news, and mounting our horses, we galloped into the headquarters and found the corral outfit already there. Miss Jean soon had our segundo an unwilling prisoner in a corner, and from his impatient manner and her low tones it was plain to be seen that her 2 days' visit with Mrs. Annear had resulted in some word for Deweese. Not wishing to intrude, I avoided them in search of my employer, finding him in Gallup at an outhouse holding a hound while Scales was taking a few stitches in an ugly cut which the dog had received from a javelina. Paying no attention to the two boys, I gave him the news and bluntly informed him that Esther and I expected to marry in May. "Bully for you, Tom," said he. "Hold this 4-foot and look out he don't bite you. So she'll get her divorce at the May term, and then all outdoors can't stand in your way the next time. Now that means you'll have to get out fully 200 more of those building rock, for your cottage will need 3 rooms. Take another stitch, knot your thread well, and be quick about it. I tell you the javelina were pretty fierce. This is the 5th dog we've doctored since we returned." On freeing the poor hound, we both looked the pack over carefully, and as no others needed attention, Aaron and Glenn were excused. No sooner were they out of hearing than I suggested that the order be made for 500 stone, as no doubt John Cotton would also need a cottage shortly after Lent. The old matchmaker beamed with smiles. "Is that right, Tom?" he inquired. "Of course, you boys tell each other what you would hardly tell me, and so they have made the riffle at last. Why, of course they shall have a cottage, and it will be so near that I can hear the baby when it cries. Bully for tow-headed John. Oh, I reckon Las Palomas is coming to the front this year. 3 new cottages and 3 new brides is not to be sneezed at. Does your mistress know all this good news?" I informed him that I had not seen Miss Jean to speak to since the funeral, and that Cotton wished his intentions kept a secret. "Of course," he said, "that's just like a sap-headed youth, as if getting married was anything to be ashamed of. Why, when I was the age of you boys, I'd have felt proud over the fact. Wants it kept a secret, does he? Well, I'll tell everybody I meet, and I'll send word to the ferry and to every ranch within 100 miles that our John Cotton and Frank Vaux are going to get married in the spring. There's nothing disgraceful in matrimony, and I'll publish this so wide that neither of them will dare back out. I've had my eye on that girl for years, and now, when there's a prospect of her becoming the wife of one of my boys, he wants it kept a secret. Well, I don't think it'll keep." After that I felt more comfortable over my confession. Before we were called to supper, every one in the house, including the Mexicans about headquarters, knew that Cotton and I were soon to be married, and all during the evening the same subject was revived at every lull in the conversation, though Deweese kept constantly intruding the corral building and making inquiries after the hunt. "What difference does it make if we hunted or not?" replied Uncle Lance to his foreman with some little feeling. "Suppose we did hunt every third or fourth day. Those Wilson folk have a way of entertaining friends which makes riding after hounds seem commonplace. Why, the girls had Glenn and Aaron on the ground until old man Nate and myself could hardly get them out on a hunt at all. And when they did, provided the girls were along, they managed to get separated, and along about dusk they'd come slouching in by pairs, looking as innocent as turtle doves. Not that those Wilson girls can't ride, for I never saw a better horsewoman than Susie, the one who took such a shine to Scales." I noticed Miss Jean cast a reproving glance at her brother on his connecting the name of Susie Wilson with that of his vagabond employee. The mistress was a Puritan in morals. That Scales fell far below her ideal there was no doubt, and that the brother knew too well not to differ with her on this subject. When all the boys had retired except Cotton and me, the brother and sister became frank with each other. "Well now, you must not blame me if Miss Susie was attentive to Aaron," said the old matchmaker, in conciliation, pacing the room. "He was from Las Palomas and their guest, and I see no harm in the girls being courteous and polite. Susie was just as nice as pie to me, and I hope you don't think I don't entertain the highest regard for Nate Wilson's family. Suppose one of the girls did smile a little too much on Aaron, was that my fault? Now, mind you, I never said a word one way or the other, but I'll bet every cow on Las Palomas that Aaron Scales, vagabond that he is, can get Susie Wilson for the asking. I know your standard of morals, but you must make allowance for others who look upon things differently from you and me. You remember Catherine Vedder, who married Carey Troup at the close of the war? There's a similar case for you. Catherine married Troup just because he was so wicked, and at least that was the reason she gave, and she and you were old run-togethers. And you remember, too, that getting married was the turning point in Carey Troup's life. Who knows but Aaron might sober down if he was to marry? Just because a man has sown a few wild oats in his youth, does that condemn him for all time? You want to be more liberal. Give me the man who has stood the fire test of life in preference to the one who's never been tempted. Now, Lance, you know that you had a motive in taking Aaron down to the Wilsons," said the sister reprovingly. "Don't get the idea that I can't read you like an open book. Your argument is as good as an admission of your object in going to Ramanera. Ever since Scales got that flirtation with Susie Vaux last summer, it was easy to see that Aaron was a favorite with you. Why don't you take Happersett around and introduce him to some nice girls? Honest, Lance, I wouldn't give poor old Dan for the big beef corral full of rascals like Scales. Look at how he trifled with that silly girl in Florida." Instead of continuing the argument, the wily ranchero changed the subject. "The trouble with Dan is he's too old. When a fellow begins to get a little gray around the edges, he gets so foxy that you couldn't bait him into a matrimonial trap with sweet grapes. But, sis, what's the matter with your keeping an eye open for a girl for Dan, if he's such a favorite with you? If I had half the interest in him that you profess, I certainly wouldn't ask any one to help. It wouldn't surprise me if the boys take to marrying freely after John and Tom bring their brides to Las Palomas. Now that Mrs. Annear is a widow, there's the same old chance for June. If Glenn doesn't make the riffle with Miss June, he ought to be shot on general principles. And I don't know, little sister, if you and I were both to oppose it, that we could prevent that rascal of an Aaron from marrying into the Wilson family. You have no idea What a case Susie and Scales scared up during our 10 days' hunt. That only leaves Dan and Theodore. But what's the use of counting the chickens so soon? You go to bed, for I'm going to send to the mission tomorrow after the Masons. There's no use in my turning in, for I won't sleep a wink tonight, thinking all this over. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of A Texas Matchmaker by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. An Indian Scare. Near the close of January '79, the Nueces Valley was stirred by an Indian scare. I had a distinct recollection of two similar scares in my boyhood on the San Antonio River, in which I never caught a glimpse of the noble red man. But whether the rumors were groundless or not, Las Palomas set her house in order. The worst thing we had to fear was the loss of our saddle stock, as they were gentle and could be easily run off and corralled on the range by stretching lariats. At this time the ranch had some 10 remudas, including nearly 500 saddle horses, some of them ranging 10 or 15 miles from the ranch, and on receipt of the first rumor, every remuda was brought in home and put under a general herd, night and day. "These Indian scares," said Uncle Lance, "are just about as regular as droughts. When I first settled here, the Indians hunted up and down this valley every few years, but they never molested anything. Why, I got well acquainted with several bucks, and used to swap rawhide with them for buckskin. Game was so abundant that there was no temptation to kill cattle or steal horses. But the rascals seem to be getting worse ever since. The last scare was just 10 years ago next month, and kept us all guessing. The renegades were Kickapoos, and came down the Frio from out west. One Sunday morning they surprised 2 of Waugh's vaqueros, while the latter were dressing a wild hog which they had killed. The Mexicans had only 1 horse and 1 gun between them. One of them took the horse, and the other took the carbine. Not daring to follow the one with the gun for fear of ambuscade, the Indians gave chase to the vaquero on horseback, whom they easily captured. After stripping him of all his clothing, they tied his hands with thongs, and pinned the poor devil to a tree with spear thrusts through the back. The other Mexican made his escape in the chaparral, and got back to the ranch. As it happened, there was only a man or 2 at Waugh's place at the time, and no attempt was made to follow the Indians, who after killing the vaquero, went on west to Altita Creek, the one which puts in the Nueces from the north, just about 20 miles above the Ganso. Waugh had a sheep camp on the head of the Altito, and there the Kickapoos killed 2 of his pastors and robbed the camp. From that creek on westward, their course was marked with murders and horse stealing, but the country was so sparsely settled that little or no resistance could be offered, and the redskins escaped without punishment. At that time they were armed with bow and arrow and spears, but I have it on good authority that all these western tribes now have firearms. The very name of Indian scares women and children, and if they should come down this river, we must keep in the open and avoid ambush, as that is an Indian forte. All the women and children at the outlying ranchitas were brought into headquarters, the men being left to look after the houses and their stock and flocks. In the interim, Father Norquin and the Masons had arrived, and the chapel was daily taking shape. But the rumors of the Indian raid thickened. Reports came in of shepherds shot with their flocks over near Espinato Lake and along the Leona River, and Las Palomas took on an air of an armed camp. Though we never ceased to ride the range whenever duty called, we went always in squads of 4 or 5. The first abatement of the scare took place when one evening a cavalcade of Texas Rangers reached our ranch from DeWitt County. They consisted of 15 mounted men under Lieutenant Frank Barr, with a commissary of 4 pack mules. The detachment was from one of the crack companies of the state, and had with them several half-blooded trailers, though every man in the squad was more or less an expert in that line. They were traveling light, and had covered over 100 miles during the day and a half preceding their arrival at headquarters. The hospitality of Las Palomas was theirs to command, and as their most urgent need was mounts, they were made welcome to the pick of every horse under herd. Sunrise saw our ranger guests on their way, leaving the high tension relaxed and everyone on the ranch breathing easier. But the Indian scare did not prove an ill wind to the plans of Father Norquin. With the concentration of the people from the ranchitas and those belonging at the home ranch, the chapel building went on by leaps and bounds. A native carpenter had been secured from Santa Maria, and the enthusiastic padre, laying aside his vestments, worked with his hands as a common laborer. The energy with which he inspired the natives made him a valuable overseer. From assisting the carpenter in hewing the rafters, to advising the masons in laying a keystone, or with his own hands mixing the mortar and tamping the earth to give firm foundation to the cement floor, he was the directing spirit. Very little lumber was used in the construction of buildings at Las Palomas. The houses were thatched with a coarse salt grass, called by the natives sacohuista. Every year in the overflowed portions of the valley, great quantities of this material were cut by the native help and stored against its need. The grass sometimes grew 2 feet in height, and at cutting was wrapped tightly and tied in hands about 2 inches in diameter. For fastening to the roofing lathe, green blades of the Spanish dagger were used, which, after being roasted over a fire to toughen the fiber, were split into thongs and bound the hands securely in a solid mass, layer upon layer like shingles. Crude as it may appear, this was a most serviceable roof, being both rainproof and impervious to heat, while owing to its compactness, a live coal of fire laid upon it would smolder but not ignite. No sooner had the masons finished the plastering of the interior walls and cementing the floor than they began on a 2-roomed cottage. As its white walls arose, conjecture was rife as to who was to occupy it. I made no bones of the fact that I expected to occupy a jacal in the near future, but denied that this was to be mine, as I had been promised one with 3 rooms. Out of hearing of our employer, John Cotton also religiously denied that the tiny house was for his use. Fidel, however, took the chaffing without a denial, the padre and Uncle Lance being his 2 worst tormentors. During the previous visit of the padre, when the chapel was decided on, the order for the finishing materials for the building had been placed with a merchant at Shepherd's, and was brought up from Corpus Christi through his freighters. We now had notice from the merchant that his teamsters had returned, and 2 4-mule teams went down to the ferry for the lumber, glassware, sashes, and doors. Miss Jean had been importuning the padre daily to know when the dedication would take place, as she was planning to invite the countryside. "Ah, my daughter," replied the priest, "we must learn to cultivate patience. All things that abide are of slow but steady growth, and my work is for eternity. Therefore I must be an earnest servant, so that when my life's duty ends, it can be said in truth, 'Well done, thou good and faithful servant.' But I am as anxious to consecrate this building to the Master's service as anyone. My good woman, if I only had a few parishioners like you, we would work wonders among these natives." On the return of the mule teams, the completion of the building could be determined, and the padre announced the 21st of February as the date of dedication. On reaching this decision, The ranch was set in order for an occasion of more than ordinary moment. Fidel and Juana were impatient to be married, and the master and mistress had decided that the ceremony should be performed the day after the dedication, and all the guests of the ranch should remain for the festivities. The padre, still in command, dispatched the vaquero to the mission, announcing the completion of the chapel and asking for a brother priest to bring out certain vestments and assist in the dedicatory exercises. The Indian scare was subsiding, and as no word had come from the rangers, confidence grew that the worst was over. So we scattered in every direction inviting guests, from the Booths on the Frio to the Wilsons of Ramonera, and along the home river as far as Lagarto. Our friends were bidden in the name of the master and mistress of Las Palomas. On my return from taking the invitations to the ranches north, the chapel was just receiving the finishing touches. The cross crowning the front glistened in fresh paint, while on the interior walls shone cheap lithographs of the Madonna and Christ. The old padre, proud and jealous as a bridegroom over his bride, directed the young friar here and there, himself standing aloof and studying with an artist's eye every effect in color and drapery. The only discordant note in the interior was the rough benches, in the building of which Father Norquin himself had worked, thus following, as he repeatedly admonished us, in the footsteps of his master, the carpenter of Galilee. The ceremony of dedication was to be followed by a mass at high noon. Don Mateo Gonzales of Santa Maria sent his regrets, as did likewise Don Alejandro Trevino of the mission. But the other invited guests came early and stayed late. The women and children of the outlying ranchitas had not yet returned to their homes, and with our invited guests made an assembly of nearly 150 persons. Unexpectedly, and within 2 hours of the appointed time for the service to commence, a cavalcade was sighted approaching the ranch from the west. As they turned in towards headquarters, someone recognized the horses, and a shout of welcome greeted our ranger guests of over 2 weeks before. Uncle Lance met them as if they had been expected, and invited the lieutenant and his men to dismount and remain a few days as guests of Las Palomas. When they urged the importance of continuing on their journey to report to the governor, the host replied, "Lieutenant Barr, that don't go here. Fall out of your saddles and borrow all the razors and white shirts on the ranch, for we need you for the dedication of the chapel today, and for a wedding and infare for tomorrow. We don't see you along this river as often as we'd like to, and when you do happen along in time for a peaceful duty, you can't get away so easily. If you had any special report to make to your superiors, why, write her out, and I'll send a vaquero with it to Oakville this afternoon, and it'll go north on the stage tomorrow. But, Lieutenant, you mustn't think you can ride right past Las Palomas when you're not under emergency orders. Now, fall off those horses and spruce up a little, for I intend to introduce you to some as nice girls as you ever met. You may want to quit rangering some day, and I may need a man about your size, and I'm getting tired of single ones." Lieutenant Barr surrendered. Saddles were stripped from horses, packs were unlashed from mules, and every animal was sent to our remudas under herd. The accoutrements were stacked inside the gate like haycocks, with slickers thrown over them. The carbines were thrown on the gallery, and from every nail, peg, or hook on the wall, belts and six-shooters hung in groups. These rangers were just ordinary-looking men, and they might have been mistaken for an outfit of cowhands. In age they ranged from a smiling youth of 20 to grizzled men of 40. Yet in every countenance was written a resolute determination. All the razors of the ranch were brought into immediate use, while every presentable shirt, collar, and tie in the house was unearthed and placed at their disposal. While arranging hasty toilets, the men informed us that when they reached Esponto's Lake, the redskins had left, and that they had trailed them south until the Indians had crossed the Rio Grande into Mexico, several days in advance of their arrival. The usual number of isolated sheep herders killed and of horses stolen were the features of that raid. The guests had been arriving all morning. The Booths had reached the ranch the night before, and the last to put in an appearance was the contingent from the Frio and San Miguel. Before the appearance of the Rangers, they had been sighted across the river, and they rode up with LibriVox like a captain of the old guard in the lead. "Ah, Don Lance," he cried, "what you think? They say Don Pierre no rides fast going to church. These youngsters laugh all the time, and say I never get here unless the dogs is along. Sacre! At all times like I was old man hombre. Keep away from this horse, he allow nobody but me to lay one hand on him. Keep away, I told you." I helped the girls to dismount, Miss Jean kissing them right and left, and bustling them off into the house to tidy up as fast as possible, for the hour was almost at hand. On catching sight of Mrs. Annear, fresh and charming in her widow's weeds, Uncle Lance brushed Don Pierre aside and cordially greeted her. Vaqueros took the horses, and as I strolled up the pathway with Esther, I noticed an upper window full of Ranger faces peering down on the girls. Before this last contingent had had time to spruce up, Pasquale's eldest boy rode around all the jacals, ringing a small handbell to summon the population to the dedication. Outside of our home crowd, we had 40 white guests, not including the 2 Booth children and the priests. As fast as the Rangers were made presentable, the masters and mistress introduced them to all the girls present. Of course, there were a few who could not be enticed near a woman, but Quayle and Happersett, like kindred spirits, took the backward ones under their wing, and the procession started for the chapel. The audience was typical of the Texas frontier at the close of the '70s. 2 priests of European birth conducted the services. Pioneer cowmen of various nationalities and their families intermingled, and occupied central seats. By the side of his host, a veteran of 36, when Mexican rule was driven from the land, sat Lieutenant Barr, then engaged in accomplishing a second redemption of the state from crime and lawlessness. Lovable and esteemed men were present, who had followed the fortunes of war until the Southern flag, to which they had rallied, went down in defeat. The younger generation of men were stalwart in physique, while the girls were modest in their rustic beauty. Sitting on the cement floor on 3 sides of us were the natives of the ranch, civilized, but with little improvement over their Aztec ancestors. The dedicatory exercises were brief and simple. Everyone was invited to remain for the celebration of the first Mass in the newly consecrated building. Many who were not communicants accepted, but noticing the mistress and my sweetheart taking their leave, I joined them and assisted in arranging the tables so that all our guests could be seated at 2 sittings. At the conclusion of the service, dinner was waiting, and Father Norquin and Mr. Nate Wilson were asked to carve at one table, while the young friar and Lieutenant Barr, in a similar capacity, officiated at the other. There was so much volunteer help in the kitchen that I was soon excused and joined the younger people on the gallery. As to whom Cotton and Gallup were monopolizing, there was no doubt, but I had a curiosity to notice what Scales would do when placed between 2 fires. But not for nothing had he cultivated the acquaintance of a sandy mustached young ranger, who was at that moment entertaining Susanna Vaux in an alcove at the farther end of the veranda. Aaron, when returning from the chapel with Susie Wilson, had succeeded in getting no nearer the house than a clump of oak trees which sheltered an old rustic settee. And when the young folks were called in to dinner, the vagabond Scales and Miss Wilson of Ramanera had to be called the second time. In seating the younger generation, Miss Jean showed her finesses. Nearly all the Rangers had dined at the first table, but the widow Annear waited for the second one. Why, only a privileged few of us could guess. Artfully, and with seeming unconsciousness on the part of every one, Deweese was placed beside the charming widow, though I had a suspicion that June was the only innocent party in the company. Captain Byler and I were carving at the same table, at which our foreman and the widow were seated, and, being in the secret, I noted step by step the progress of the widow and the signs of gradual surrender of the Corporal Segundo. I had a distinct recollection of having once smashed some earnest resolves, and of having capitulated under similar circumstances. And now being happily in love, I secretly wished success to little god Cupid in the case in hand. And all during that afternoon and evening it was clearly apparent to any one who cared to notice that success was very likely. The evening was a memorable one at Las Palomas. Never before in my knowledge had the ranch had so many and such amiable guests. The Rangers took kindly to our hospitality, and Father Norquin waddled about, God blessing every one, old and young, frivolous and sedate. Owing to the nature of the services of the day, the evening was spent in conversation among the elders, while the younger element promenaded the spacious gallery or occupied alcoves, nooks, and corners about the grounds. On retiring for the night, the men yielded the house to the women guests, sleeping on the upper and lower verandas, while the Ranger contingent, scorning beds or shelter, unrolled their blankets under the spreading live oaks in the yard. But the real interest centered in the marriage of Fidel and Juana, which took place at 6 o'clock the following evening. Every one, including the native element, repaired to the new chapel to attend the wedding. Uncle Lance and his sister had rivaled each other as to whether man or maid should have the better outfit. Fidel was physically far above the average of the natives, slightly bow-legged, stolid, and the coolest person in the church. The bride was in quite a flutter, but having been coached and rehearsed daily by her mistress, managed to get through the ordeal. The young priest performed the ceremony using his own native tongue, the rich silvery accents of Spanish. At the conclusion of the service, every one congratulated the happy couple, the women and girls in tears, the sterner sex without demonstration of feeling. When we were outside the chapel and waiting for our sweethearts to dry the tears and join us, Uncle Lance came swaggering over to John Cotton and me, and slapping us both on the back, said, "Boys, that rascal of a Fidel had a splendid nerve. Did you notice how he faced the guns without a tremor, never batted an eye, but took his medicine like a little man? I hope both of you boys will show equally good nerve when your turn comes. Why, I doubt if there was a Ranger in the whole squad, unless it was that red-headed rascal who kissed the bride, who would have stood the test like that vaquero, without a shiver. And it's something you can't get used to. Now, as you all know, I've been married 3 times. The first 2 times I was as cool as most, but the third whirl I trembled all over. Quavers ran through me, my tongue was palsied, my teeth chattered, my knees knocked together, and I felt like a man that was sent for and couldn't go. Now, mind you, it was the 3rd time, and I was only 45. What a night that was! The contents of the warehouse had been shifted. Native musicians had come up from Santa Maria, and every one about the home ranch who could strum a guitar was pressed into service. The storeroom was given over to the natives, and after honoring the occasion with their presence, As patrons, the master and mistress, after the opening dance, withdrew in company with their guests. The night had then barely commenced. Claiming two guitarists, we soon had our guests waltzing on the veranda, hall, and spacious dining room to the music of my fiddle. Several of the rangers could play, and by taking turns, every one had a joyous time, including the two priests. Among the Mexicans, the dancing continued until daybreak. Shortly after midnight, our guests retired, and the next morning found all, including the priests, preparing to take their departure. As was customary, we rode a short distance with our guests, bidding them again to Las Palomas, and receiving similar invitations in return. With the exception of Captain Byler, the rangers were the last to take their leave. When the mules were packed and their mounts saddled, the old ranchero extended them a welcome whenever they came that way again. "Well now, Mr. Lovelace," said Lieutenant Barr, "you had better not press that invitation too far. The good time we had with you discounts rangering for the state of Texas. Rest assured, sir, that we will not soon forget the hospitality of Las Palomas, nor its ability to entertain. Push on with the packs, boys, and I'll take leave of the mistress in behalf of you all, and overtake the squad before it reaches the river." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of A Texas Matchmaker by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Horse brands. Before gathering the fillies and mares that spring, and while riding the range, locating our horse stock, Pasquale brought in word late one evening that a Ladino stallion had killed the regular one, and was then in possession of the manada. The fight between the outlaw and the ranch stallion had evidently occurred above the mouth of the Gonzo, and several miles to the north of the home river, for he had accidentally found the carcass of the dead horse at a small lake, and, recognizing the animal by his color, had immediately scoured the country in search of the band. He had finally located the manada many miles off their range, but at sight of the vaquero, the Ladino usurper had deserted the mares, halting however out of gunshot, yet following at a safe distance as Pasquale drifted them back. Leaving the manada on their former range, Pasquale had ridden into the ranch and reported. It was then too late in the day to start against the interloper, as the range was fully 25 miles away, and we were delayed the next morning in getting up speedy saddle horses from distant and various remudas, and did not get away from the ranch until after dinner. But then we started, taking the usual pack mules and provisioned for a week's outing. Included in the party was Captain Frank Byler, the regular home crowd, and 3 Mexicans. With an extra saddle horse for each, we rode away merrily to declare war on the Ladino stallion. "This is the 3rd time since I've been ranching here," said Uncle Lance to Captain Frank as we rode along, "that I've had stallions killed. There always has been bands of wild horses west here between the Leona and Nueces River and around Espanto Lake. Now that country is settling up, the people walk down the bands, and the small stallions escape, and in drifting about find our range. They're wily rascals, and our old stallions don't stand any more show with them than a fat hog would with a javelina. That's why I take as much pride in killing one as I do a rattlesnake." We made camp early that evening on the home river opposite the range of the manada, sending out Pasquale to locate the band and watch them until dark. Uncle Lance outlined his idea of circling the band and bagging the outlaw in the uncertain light of dawn. Pasquale reported on his return after dark that the manada were contentedly feeding on their accustomed range within 3 miles of camp. Pasquale had watched the band for an hour, and described the ladino stallion as a cinnamon-colored coyote, splendidly proportioned and unusually large for a mustang. Naturally, in expectation of the coming sport, the horses became the topic around the campfire that night. Every man present was a born horseman, and there was a generous rivalry for the honor in telling horse stories. Aaron Scales joined the group at a fortunate time to introduce an incident from his own experiences, and, raking out a coal of fire for his pipe, began. "The first ranch I ever worked on," said he, "was located on the Navidad in Lavaca County. It was quite a new country then, rather broken and timbered in places, and full of bear and wolves. Our outfit was working some cattle before the general roundup in the spring. We wanted to move one brand to another range as soon as the grass would permit, and we were gathering them for that purpose. We had some 90 saddle horses with us to do the work, sufficient to mount 15 men. One night we camped in a favorite spot, and as we had no cattle to hold that night, all the horses were thrown loose, with the usual precautions of hobbling, except 2 or 3 on picket. All but about 10 head wore the bracelets, and those 10 were pals, their partners wearing the hemp. Early in the evening, probably 9 o'clock, with a bright fire burning, and the boys spreading down their beds for the night, suddenly the horses were heard running, and the next moment they hobbled into camp like a school of porpoises, trampling over the beds and crowding up to the fire and the wagon. They almost knocked down some of the boys, so sudden was their entrance. Then they set up a terrible nickering for mates. The boys went amongst them, and the horses that were timid and shy almost caressed their riders, trembling in limb and muscle the while through fear like a leaf. We concluded a bear had scented the camp, and in approaching it had circled round and run amuck our saddle horses. Every horse by instinct is afraid of a bear, but more particularly a range-raised one. It's the same instinct that makes it impossible to ride or drive a range-raised horse over a rattlesnake. Well, after the boys had petted their mounts and quieted their fears, they were still reluctant to leave camp, but stood around for several hours, evidently feeling more secure in our presence. Now and then one of the free ones would graze out a little distance, cautiously sniff the air, then trot back to the others. We built up a big fire to scare away any bear or wolves that might be in the vicinity, but the horses stayed like invited guests, perfectly contented as long as we would pet them and talk to them. Some of the boys crawled under the wagon, hoping to get a little sleep rather than spread their beds where a horse could stampede over it. Near midnight we took ropes and saddle blankets and drove them several hundred yards from camp. The rest of the night we slept with one eye open, expecting every moment to hear them take fright and return. They didn't, but at daylight every horse was within 500 yards of the wagon, and when we unhobbled them and broke camp that morning, we had to throw riders in the lead to hold them back. On the conclusion of Scales's experience, there was no lack of volunteers to take up the thread, though an unwritten law forbade interruptions. Our employer was among the group, and out of deference to our guests, the boys remained silent. Uncle Lance finally regaled us with an account of a fight between range stallions which he had once witnessed, and on its conclusion Theodore Quayle took his turn. The man I was working for once moved nearly 1,000 head of mixed range stock, of which about 300 were young mules, from the San Saba to the Concho River. It was a dry country, and we were compelled to follow the McCavitt and Fort Chadbourne trail. We had timed our drives so that we reached creeks once a day at least, sometimes oftener. It was the latter part of summer, and was unusually hot and drouthy. There was one drive of 25 miles ahead that the owner knew of without water, and we had planned this drive so as to reach it at noon, drive halfway, make a dry camp overnight, and reach the pools by noon the next day. Imagine our chagrin on reaching the watering place to find the stream dry. We lost several hours riding up and down the arroyo in hopes of finding relief for the men if not for the stock. It had been dusty for weeks. The cook had a little water in his keg, but only enough for drinking purposes. It was 20 miles yet to the Concho, and making it before night we must. Turning back was farther than going ahead, and the afternoon was fearfully hot. The heat waves looked like a sea of fire. The first part of the afternoon drive was a gradual ascent for 15 miles, and then came a narrow plateau of a divide. As we reached this mesa, a sorrier looking lot of men, horses, and mules can hardly be imagined. We had already traveled over 40 miles without water for the stock, and 5 more lay between us and the coveted river. The heat was oppressive to the men, but the herd suffered most from the fine alkali dust which enveloped them. Their eyebrows and nostrils were whitened with this fine powder, while all colors merged into one. On reaching this divide, we could see the cottonwoods that outlined the stream ahead. Before we had fully crossed this watershed and begun the descent, the mules would trot along beside the riders in the lead, even permitting us to lay our hands on their back. It was getting late in the day before the first friendly breeze of the afternoon blew softly in our faces. Then, great Scott, what a change came over man and herd! The mules in front threw up their heads and broke into a grand chorus. Those that were strung out took up the refrain and trotted forward. The horses set up a rival concert in a higher key. They had scented the water 5 miles off. All hands except one man on each side now rode in the lead. Every once in a while some enthusiastic mule would break through the line of horsemen, and would have to be brought back. Every time we came to an elevation where we could catch the breeze, the grand horse and mule concert would break out anew. At the last elevation between us and the water, several mules broke through, and before they could be brought back, the whole herd had broken into a run which was impossible to check. We opened out then and let them go. The Concho was barely running, but had long deep pools here and there, into which horses and mules plunged, dropping down, rolled over, and then got up to nicker and bray. The young mules did everything but drink, while the horses were crazy with delight. When the wagon came up, we went into camp and left them to play out their hands. There was no herding to do that night, as the water would hold them as readily as 100 men. "Well, I'm going to hunt my blankets," said Uncle Lance, rising. "You understand, Captain, that you are to sleep with me tonight. Davy Crockett once said that the politest man he ever met in Washington simply set out the decanter and glasses, and then walked over and looked out the window while he took a drink. Now I want to be equally polite, and don't want to hurry you to sleep. But whenever you get tired of yarning, you'll find a bed with me in it, to the windward of that live oak tree top over yonder." Captain Frank showed no inclination to accept the invitation just then, but assured his host that he would join him later. An hour or two passed by. "Haven't you fellows gone to bed yet?" came an inquiry from out of the fallen tree top beyond the fire in a voice which we all recognized. "All right, boys, sit up all night and tell fool stories if you want to, but remember, I'll have the last rascal of you in the saddle an hour before daybreak. I have little sympathy for a man who won't sleep when he has a good chance. So if you don't turn in at all, it will be all right, but you'll be routed out at 3 in the morning, and the man who requires a second calling will get a bucket of water in his face." Captain Frank and several of us rose, expecting to take the hint of our employer, when our good intentions were arrested by a query from Dan Happersett. "Did any of you ever walk down a wild horse?" None of us had, and we turned back and reseated ourselves in the group. "I had a little whirl of it once when I was a youngster," said Dan, "except we didn't walk. It was well known that there were several bands of wild horses ranging in the southwest corner of Tom Green County. Those who had seen them described one band as numbering 40 to 50 head, with a fine chestnut stallion as a leader. Their range was well located when water was plentiful, but during certain months of the year the shallow lagoons where they watered dried up, and they were compelled to leave. It was when they were forced to go to other waters that glimpses of them were to be had, and then only at a distance of 1 or 2 miles. There was an outfit made up one spring to go out to their range and walk these horses down. This season of the year was selected, as the lagoons would be full of water, and the horses would naturally be reduced in flesh and strength after the winter, as well as weak and thin-blooded from their first taste of grass. We took along 2 wagons, one loaded with grain for our mounts. These saddle horses had been eating grain for months before we started, and their flesh was firm and solid. We headed for the lagoons, which were known to a few of our party, and when we came within 10 miles of the water holes, we saw fresh signs of a band, places where they had apparently grazed within a week. But it was the second day before we caught sight of the wild horses, and too late in the day to give them chase. They were watering at a large lake south of our camp, and we did not disturb them. We watched them until nightfall, and that night we planned to give them chase at daybreak. 4 of us were to do the riding by turns, and imaginary stations were allotted to the 4 quarters of our camp. If they refused to leave their range and circled, we could send them at least 150 miles the first day, ourselves riding possibly 100, and this riding would be divided among 4 horses, with plenty of fresh ones at camp for a change. Being the lightest rider in the party, it was decided that I was to give them the first chase. We had a crafty plainsman for our captain, and long before daylight he and I rode out and waited for the first peep of day. Before the sun had risen, we sighted the wild herd within a mile of the place where darkness had settled over them the night previous. With a few parting instructions from our captain, I rode leisurely between them and the lake where they had watered the evening before. At first sight of me, they took fright and ran to a slight elevation. There they halted a moment, craning their necks and sniffing the air. This was my first fair view of the chestnut stallion. He refused to break into a gallop, and even stopped before the rest, turning defiantly on this intruder of his domain. From the course I was riding, every moment I was expecting them to catch the wind of me. Suddenly they scented me, knew me for an enemy, and with the stallion in the lead, they were off to the south. It was an exciting ride that morning. Without a halt they ran 20 miles to the south, and then turned to the left and there halted on an elevation. But a shot in the air told them that all was not well, and they moved on. For an hour and a half they kept their course to the east, and at last turned to the north. This was, as we had calculated, about their range. In another hour at the farthest, a new rider with a fresh horse would take up the running. My horse was still fresh and enjoying the chase when, on a swell of the plain, I made out the rider who was to relieve me, and though it was early yet in the day, the mustangs had covered 60 miles to my 40. When I saw my relief locate the band, I turned and rode leisurely to camp. When the last 2 riders came into camp that night, they reported having left the herd at a new lake to which the mustang had led them, some 15 miles from our camp to the westward. Each day for the following week was a repetition of the first with varying incident, but each day it was plain to be seen that they were fagging fast. Toward the evening of the 8th day, the rider dared not crowd them for fear of their splitting into small bands, a thing to be avoided. On the 9th day, 2 riders took them at a time, pushing them unmercifully, but preventing them from splitting. And in the evening of this day, they could be turned at the will of the riders. It was then agreed that after a half day's chase on the morrow, they could be handled with ease. By noon next day, we had driven them within a mile of our camp. They were tired out, and we turned them into an impromptu corral made of wagons and ropes, all but the chestnut stallion. At the last he escaped us. He stopped on a little knoll and took a farewell look at his band. There were 4 old United States cavalry horses among our captive band of mustangs, gray with age and worthless, no telling where they came from. We clamped a mule shoe over the pasterns of the younger horses, tied toggles to the others, and the next morning set out on our return to the settlements. Under his promise the old ranchero had the camp astir over an hour before dawn. Horses were brought in from picket ropes and divided into 2 squads, Pasquale leading off to the windward of where the band was located at dusk previous. The rest of the men followed Uncle Lance to complete the leeward side of the circle. The location of the manada had been described as between a small hill covered with Spanish bayonet on one hand and a Sacawista flat nearly a mile distant on the other, both well-known landmarks. As we rode out and approached the location, we dropped a man every half mile until the hill and adjoining salt flat had been surrounded. We had divided what rifles the ranch owned between the 2 squads, so that each side of the circle was armed with 4 guns. I had a carbine, and had been stationed about midway on the leeward half circle. At first sign of dawn, the signal agreed upon, a turkey call, sounded back down the line, and we advanced. The circle was fully 2 miles in diameter, and on receiving the signal, I rode slowly forward, halting at every sound. It was a cloudy morning, and dawn came late for clear vision. Several times I dismounted, and in approaching objects at a distance, drove my horse before me, only to find that as light increased I was mistaken. When both the flat and the dagger-crowned hill came into view, not a living object was in sight. I had made the calculation that, had the manada grazed during the night, we should be far to the leeward of the band, for it was reasonable to expect that they would feed against the wind. But there was also the possibility that the outlaw might have herded the band several miles distant during the night, and while I was meditating on this theory, a shot rang out about a mile distant and behind the hill. Giving my horse the rowel, I rode in the direction of the report, but before I reached the hill, the manada tore around it, almost running into me. The coyote mustang was leading the band, but as I halted for a shot, he turned inward, and the mares intervening, cut off my opportunity. But the warning shot had reached every rider on the circle, and as I plied rowel and quirt to turn the band, Tio Tiburcio cut in before me and headed them backward. As the band whirled away from us, the stallion forged to the front, and by biting and a free use of his heels, attempted to turn the manada on their former course. But it mattered little which way they turned now, for our cordon was closing round them, the windward line then being less than a mile distant. As the band struck the eastward or windward line of horsemen, the mares, except for the control of the stallion, would have yielded, but now, under his leadership, they recoiled like a band of ladinos. But every time they approached the line of the closing circle they were checked, and as the cordon closed to less than a half mile in diameter, In spite of the outlaw's lashings, the manada quieted down and halted. Then we unslung our carbines and rifles and slowly closed in upon the quarry. Several times the mustang stallion came to the outskirts of the band, uttering a single piercing snort, but never exposing himself for a shot. Little by little as we edged in he grew impatient, and finally trotted out boldly as if determined to forsake his harem and rush the line. But the moment he cleared the band, Uncle Lance dismounted, and as he knelt, the stallion stopped like a statue, gave a single challenging snort, which was answered by a rifle report, and he fell in his tracks. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of A Texas Matchmaker by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Shadows. Spring was now at hand, after an unusually mild winter. With the breaking of the drought of the summer before, there had sprung up all through the encinal and sandy lands an immense crop of weeds, called by the natives margosa, fallow weed. This plant had thriven all winter, and the cattle had forsaken the best mesquite grazing in the river bottoms to forage on it. The results showed that their instincts were true, for with very rare exceptions, every beef on the ranch was fit for the butcher's block. Truly it was a year of fatness succeeding a lean one. Never during my acquaintance with Las Palomas had I seen the cattle come through a winter in such splendid condition. But now there was no market. Faint rumors reached us of trail herds being put up in nearby counties, and it was known that several large ranches in Nueces County were going to try the experiment of sending their own cattle up the trail. Lack of demand was discouraging to most ranchmen, and our range was glutted with heavy steer cattle. The first spring work of any importance was gathering the horses to fill a contract we had with Captain Byler. Previous to the herd which Deweese had sold and delivered at Fort Worth the year before, our horse stock had amounted to about 4,000 head. With the present sale, the ranch holdings would be much reduced, and it was our intention to retain all manadas used in the breeding of mules. When we commenced gathering, we worked over every one of our 60-odd bands, cutting out all the fillies and barren mares. In disposing of whole manadas, we kept only the geldings and yearlings, throwing in the old stallions for good measure, as they would be worthless to us when separated from their harems. In less than a week's time we had made up the herd, and as they were all in the straight horse hoof, we did not road brand them. While gathering them, we put them under day and night herd, throwing in 5 remudas as we had agreed, but keeping back the bell mares, as they were gentle and would be useful in forming new bands of saddle horses. The day before the appointed time for the delivery, the drover brought up saddle horses and enough picked mares to make his herd number 1,500. The only unpleasant episode of the sale was a difference between Theodore Quayle and my employer. Quayle had cultivated the friendship of the drover until the latter had partially promised him a job with the herd in case there was no objection. But when Uncle Lance learned that Theodore expected to accompany the horses, he took Captain Frank to task for attempting to entice away his men. The drover entered a strong disclaimer, maintaining that he had promised Quayle a place only in case it was satisfactory to all concerned. Further, that in trail work with horses he preferred Mexican vaqueros, and had only made the conditional promise as a favor to the young man. Uncle Lance accepted the explanation and apologized to the drover, but fell on Theodore Quayle and cruelly upbraided him for forsaking the ranch without cause or reason. Theodore was speechless with humiliation, but no sooner were the hasty words spoken Then my employer saw that he had grievously hurt another's feelings, and humbly craved Quayle's pardon. The incident passed and was apparently forgotten. The herd started north on the trail on the 25th of March. Quayle stayed on at Las Palomas, and we resumed our regular spring work on the ranch. While gathering the mares and fillies, we had cut out all the geldings 4 years old and upward to the number of nearly 200. And now our usual routine of horse breaking commenced. The masons had completed their work on all 3 of the cottages and returned to the mission, but the carpenter yet remained to finish up the woodwork. Fidel and Juana had begun housekeeping in their little home, and the cozy warmth which radiated from it made me impatient to see my cottage finished. Through the mistress, arrangements had been made for the front rooms in both John's cottage and mine to be floored instead of cemented. Some 2 weeks before Easter Sunday, Cotton returned from the Frio, where he had been making a call on his intended. Uncle Lance at once questioned him to know if they had set the day, and was informed that the marriage would occur within 10 days after Lent, and that he expected first to make a hurried trip to San Antonio for a wedding gift. "That's all right, John," said the old ranchero approvingly, "and I expect Quirk might as well go with you. You can both draw every cent due you and take your time, as wages will go right on the same as if you were working. There will not be much to do except the usual horse breaking and a little repairing about the ranch. It's quite likely I shan't be able to spare Tom in the early summer, for if no cattle buyer comes along soon, I'm going to send June to the coast and let him sniff around for one. I'd like the best in the world to sell about 3,000 beeves, and we never had fatter ones than we have today. If we can make a sale, it'll keep us busy all the fore part of the summer. So both of you fellows knock off any day you want to, and go up to the city. And go horseback, for this ranch don't give Bethel and Oxenford stages any more of its money." With this encouragement, we decided to start for the city the next morning. But that evening I concluded to give a certain roan gelding a final ride before turning him over to the vaqueros. He was a vicious rascal, and after trying 100 maneuvers to unhorse me, reared and fell backward, and before I could free my foot from the stirrup, caught my left ankle, fracturing several of the small bones in the joint. That settled my going anywhere on horseback for a month, as the next morning I could not touch my foot to the ground. John did not like to go alone, and the mistress insisted that Theodore was well entitled to a vacation. The master consented, each was paid the wages due him, and catching up their own private horses, the old cronies started off to San Antonio. They expected to make Mr. Booth's ranch in a little over half a day, and from there a 60-mile ride would put them in the city. After the departure of the boys, the dull routine of ranch work went heavily forward. The horse breaking continued. Vaqueros rode the range looking after the calf crop, while I had to content myself with nursing a crippled foot and hobbling about on crutches. Had I been able to ride a horse, it was quite possible that a ranch on the San Miguel would have had me as its guest, and I must needs content myself with lying around the house, visiting with Juana, or watching the carpenters finishing the cottages. I tried several times to interest my mistress in a scheme to invite my sweetheart over for a week or two, but she put me off on one pretext and another, until I was vexed at her lack of enthusiasm. But truth compels me to do the good woman justice, and I am now satisfied that my vexation was due to my own peevishness over my condition and not to neglect on her part. And just then she was taking such an absorbing interest in June and the widow, and likewise so sisterly a concern for Dan Happersett, that it was little wonder she could give me no special attention when I was soon to be married. It was the bird in the bush that charmed Miss Jean. Toward the close of March a number of showers fell, and we had a week of damp, cloudy weather. This was unfortunate, as it called nearly every man from the horse breaking to ride the range and look after the young calves. One of the worst enemies of a newly born calf is screwworms, which flourish in wet weather, and prove fatal unless removed, for no young calf withstands the pest over a few days. Clear, dry weather was the best preventive against screwworms, but until the present damp spell abated, every man in the ranch was in the saddle from sunrise to sunset. In the midst of this emergency work, a beef buyer by the name of Wayne Orahood reached the ranch. He was representing the lessees of a steamship company plying between New Orleans and Texas coast points. The merchant at the ferry had advised Orahood to visit Las Palomas, but on his arrival about noon there was not a white man on the ranch to show him the cattle. I knew the anxiety of my employer to dispose of his mature beefs, and as the buyer was impatient, there was nothing to do but get up horses and ride the range with him. Miss Jean was anxious to have the stock shown, and in spite of my lameness, I ordered saddle horses for both of us. Unable to wear a boot, and still hobbling on crutches, I managed to Indian mount an old horse, my left foot still too inflamed to rest in the stirrup. From the ranch we rode for the encinal ridges and sandy lanes to the southeast, where the fallow weed still throve in rank profusion, and where our heaviest steers were liable to range. By riding far from the watering points, we encountered the older cattle, and within an hour after leaving the ranch, I was showing some of the largest beeves on Las Palomas. How that beef buyer did ride! Scarcely giving the cattle a passing look, he kept me leading the way from place to place where our saleable stock was to be encountered. Avoiding the ranchitos and wells, where the cows and younger cattle were to be found, we circled the extreme outskirts of our range, only occasionally halting, and then but for a single glance over some prime beeves. We turned westward from the encinal at a gallop, passing about midway between Santa Maria and the home ranch. Then we pushed on for the hills around the head of the Ganso. Not once in the entire ride did we encounter anyone but a Mexican vaquero, and there was no relief for my foot in meeting him. Several times I had an inclination to ask Mr. Orahood to remember my sore ankle, and on striking the broken country, I suggested we ride slower, as many of our oldest beeves ranged through these hills. This suggestion enabled me to ease up and to show our best cattle to advantage until the sun set. We were then 25 miles from the ranch, but neither distance nor approaching darkness checked Wayne Orahood's enthusiasm. A dozen times he remarked, "We'll look at a few more cattle, son, and then ride in home." We did finally turn homeward, and at a leisurely gait, but not until it was too dark to see cattle, and it was several hours after darkness when we sighted the lamps at headquarters, and finished the last lap in our afternoon's 60-mile ride. My employer and Mr. Orahood had met before, and greeted each other with a rugged cordiality common among cowmen. The others had eaten their supper, but while the buyer and I satisfied the inner man, Uncle Lance sat with us at the table and sparred with Orahood in repartee, or asking regarding mutual friends, artfully avoiding any mention of cattle. But after we had finished, Mr. Orahood spoke of his mission, admitted deprecatingly that he had taken a little ride south and west that afternoon, and if it was not too much trouble, he would like to look over our beeves on the north of the Nueces in the morning. He showed no enthusiasm, but acknowledged that he was buying for shipment, and thought that another month's good grass ought to put our steers in fair condition. I noticed Uncle Lance clouding up over the buyer's lack of appreciation, but he controlled himself.
And when Mr. Orahood expressed a wish to retire, my employer said to his guest, as with candle in hand the two stood in parting, "Well now, Wayne, that's too bad about the cattle being so thin. I've been working my horse stock lately, and didn't get any chance to ride the range until this wet spell. But since the screw worms got so bad, being short-handed, I had to get out and rustle myself, or we'd lost a lot of calves. Of course, I've noticed a steer now and then, and have been sorry to find them so spring poor. Actually, Wayne, if we were expecting company, we'd have to send to the ferry and get a piece of bacon, as I haven't seen a hoof fit to kill. The roast beef which you had for supper, well, that was sent to us by a neighbor who has fat cows. About a year ago now, water was awful scarce with us, and a few old cows died up and down this valley. I suppose you didn't hear of it, living so far away. Heretofore, every time we had a drought, there was such a volunteer growth of fallow weed that the cattle got mud fat following every dry spell. Still, I'll show you a few cattle among the wahia bush and sand hills on the divide in the morning, and see what you think of them. But of course, if they lack flesh, in case you are buying for shipment, I shan't expect you to bid on them." The old ranchero and the buyer rode away early the next morning, and did not return until the middle of the afternoon, having agreed on a sale. I was asked to write in duplicate the terms and conditions. In substance, Las Palomas Ranch agreed to deliver at Rockport on the coast on the 20th of May, and for each of the following 3 months, 1,250 beeves, 4-year-olds and upward. The consideration was $27.50 per head, payable on delivery. I knew my employer had oversold his holdings, but there would be no trouble in making up the 5,000 head, as all our neighbors would gladly turn in cattle to fill the contract. The buyer was working on commission, and the larger the quantity he could contract for, the better he was suited. After the agreement had been signed in duplicate, Mr. Orahood smilingly admitted that ours were the best beeves he had bought that spring. "I knew it," said Uncle Lance. "You don't suppose I've been ranching in this valley over 40 years without knowing a fat steer when I see one? Tom, send a muchacho after a bundle of mint. Wayne, you haven't got a lick of sense in riding. I'm as tired as a dog." The buyer returned to Shepherd's the next morning. The horse breaking was almost completed, except allotting them into remudas, assigning bell mares, and putting each band under herd for a week or 10 days. The weather was fairing off, relieving the strain of riding the range, and the ranch once more relaxed into its languid existence. By a peculiar coincidence, Easter Sunday occurred on April the 13th that year, it being also the 66th birthday of the ranchero. Miss Jean usually gave a little home dinner on her brother's birthday, and had planned for one this occasion, which was but a few days distant. In the mail, which had been sent for on Saturday before Easter, a letter had come from John Cotton to his employer, saying that he would start home in a few days, and wanted Father Norquin sent for, as the wedding would take place on the 19th of the month. He also mentioned the fact that Theodore expected to spend a day or two with the Booths returning, but he would ride directly down to the Vaux ranch, and possibly the two would reach home about the same time. I doubt if Uncle Lance ever enjoyed a happier birthday than this one. There was every reason why he should enjoy it. For a man of his age, his years rested lightly. The ranch had never been more prosperous. Even the drought of the year before had not proved an ill wind, for the damage then sustained had been made up by conditions resulting in one of the largest sales of cattle in the history of the ranch. A chapel and 3 new cottages had been built without loss of time and at very little expense. A number of children had been born to the soil, while the natives were as loyal to their master as subjects in the days of feudalism. There was but one thing lacking to fill the cup to overflowing. The ranchero was childless. Possessed with a love of the land so deep as to be almost his religion, he felt the need of an heir. "Birthdays to a man of my years," said Uncle Lance, over Easter dinner, "are food for reflection. When one nears the limit of his allotted days and looks back over his career, there is little that satisfies. Financial success is a poor equivalent for other things. But here I am preaching when I ought to be rejoicing. Some one get John's letter and read it again. Let's see. The 19th falls on Saturday. Lucky day for Las Palomas. Well, we'll have the padre here, and if he says barbecue of beef, down goes the fattest one on the ranch. This is the year in which we expect to press our luck. I begin to feel it in my old bones that the turning point has come. When Father Norquin arrives, I think I'll have him preach us a sermon on the evils of single life. But then it's hardly necessary, for most of you boys have got your eye on some girl right now. Well, hasten the day, every rascal of you, and you'll find the cottage ready at a month's notice." The morning following Easter opened bright and clear, while on every hand were the signs of spring. A vaquero was dispatched to the mission to summon the padre, carrying both a letter and the compliments of the ranch. Among the jobs outlined for the week was the repairing of a well, the walls of which had caved in, choking a valuable water supply with debris. This morning Deweese took a few men and went to the well to raise the piping and make the necessary repairs, curbing being the most important. But while the foreman and Santiago Ortez were standing on a temporary platform some 30 feet down, a sudden and unexpected cave-in occurred above them. Deweese saw the danger, called to his companion, and in a flash laid hold of a rope with which materials were being lowered. The foreman's warning to his companion reached the helpers above, and Deweese was hastily windlassed to the surface. But the unfortunate vaquero was caught by the falling debris, he and the platform being carried down into the water beneath. The body of Ortiz was recovered late that evening. A coffin was made during the night, and the next morning the unfortunate man was laid in his narrow home. The accident threw a gloom over the ranch, yet no one dreamt that a second disaster was at hand. But the middle of the week passed without the return of either of the absent boys. Foul play began to be suspected, and meanwhile Father Norquin arrived, fully expecting to solemnize within a few days the marriage of one of the missing men. Aaron Scales was dispatched to the Vox ranch, and returned the next morning by daybreak with the information that neither quail nor cotton had been seen on the Frio recently. A vaquero was sent to the Booth ranch, who brought back the intelligence that neither of the missing boys had been seen since they passed northward some 2 weeks before. Father Norquin, as deeply affected as anyone, returned to the mission, unable to offer a word of consolation. Several days passed without tidings. As the days lengthened into a week, the master, as deeply mortified over the incident as if the two had been his own sons, let his suspicion fall on Quayle. And at last, when light was thrown on the mystery, the old ranchero's intuition proved correct. My injured foot improved slowly, and before I was able to resume my duties on the ranch, I rode over one day to the San Miguel for a short visit. Tony Hunter had been down to Oakville a few days before my arrival, and while there had met Clint Dansdale, who was well acquainted with quail and cotton. Clint, it appeared, had been in San Antonio and met our missing men, and the three had spent a week in the city chumming together. As Dansdale was also on horseback, the trio had agreed to start home the same time, traveling in company until their ways separated. Cotton had told Dansdale what business had brought him to the city, and received the latter's congratulations. The boys had decided to leave for home on the 9th, and on the morning of the day set forth, moneyless but rich in trinkets and toggery. But somewhere about 40 miles south of San Antonio, they met a trail herd of cattle from the Aransas River. Some trouble had occurred between the foreman and his men the day before, and that morning several of the latter had taken French leave. On meeting the travelers, the trail boss, being short-handed, had offered all three of them a berth. Quayle had accepted without a question. The other two had stayed all night with the herd, Dansdale attempting to dissuade Cotton, and Quayle, on the other hand, persuaded him to go with the cattle. In the end Quayle's persuasions won. Dansdale admitted that the opportunity appealed strongly to him, but he refused the trail foreman's blandishments and returned to his ranch, while the two Las Palomas lads accompanied the herd, neither one knowing or caring where they were going. When I returned home and reported this to my employer, he was visibly affected. "So that explains all," said he, "and my surmises regarding Theodore were correct. I have no particular right to charge him with ingratitude, and yet this ranch was as much his home as mine. He had the same to eat, drink, and wear as I had, with none of the concern, and yet he deserted me. I never spoke harshly to him but once, and now I wish I had let him go with Captain Byler. That would have saved me Cotton and the present disgrace to Las Palomas. I ought to have known that a good honest boy like John would be putty in the hands of a fellow like Theodore. But it's just like a fool boy to throw away his chances in life. They still sell their birthright for a mess of pottage. And there stands the empty cottage to remind me that I have something to learn. Old as I am, my temper will sometimes get away from me. Tom, you are my next hope, and I am almost afraid some unseen obstacle will arise as this one did." "Does Francis know the facts?" I answered that Hunter had kept the facts to himself, not even acquainting his own people with them, so that aside from myself, he was the first to know the particulars. After pacing the room for a time in meditation, Uncle Lance finally halted and asked me if Scales would be a capable messenger to carry the news to the Vox family. I admitted that he was the most tactful man on the ranch. Aaron was summoned, given the particulars, and commanded to use the best diplomacy at his command in transmitting the facts, and to withhold nothing, to express to the ranchman and his family the deep humiliation everyone at Las Palomas felt over the actions of John Cotton. Years afterward I met Quayle at a trail town in the north. In the limited time at our command, the old days we spent together in the Nueces Valley occupied most of our conversation. Unmentioned by me, his desertion of Las Palomas was introduced by himself, and in attempting to apologize for his actions, he said, "Quirk, that was the only dirty act I was ever guilty of. I never want to meet the people the trick was practiced on. Leaving Las Palomas was as much my privilege as going there was. But I was unfortunate enough to incur a few debts while living there that nothing but personal revenge could ever repay. Had it been any other man than Lance Lovelace, here I would have died the morning Captain Byler's horse herd started from the Nueces River. But he was an old man, and my hand was held and my tongue was silent. You know the tricks of a certain girl who, with her foot on my neck, stretched forth a welcoming hand to a rival. Tom, I have lived to pay her my last obligation in a revenge so sweet that if I die an outcast on the roadside, all accounts are square." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of A Texas Matchmaker by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Interlocutory Proceedings. A big summer's work lay before us. When Uncle Lance realized the permanent loss of 3 men from the working force of Las Palomas, he rallied to the situation. The ranch would have to run a double outfit the greater portion of the summer, and men would have to be secured to fill our ranks. White men who are willing to isolate themselves on a frontier ranch were scarce, but the natives, when properly treated, were serviceable and, where bred to the occupation and inclined to domesticity, made ideal vaqueros. My injured foot improved slowly, and as soon as I was able to ride, it fell to me to secure the extra help needed. The desertion of Quayle and Cotton had shaken my employer's confidence to a noticeable degree, and in giving me my orders to secure vaqueros, he said, "Tom, you take a good horse and go down the Tarancalous and engage 5 vaqueros. Satisfy yourself that the men are fit for the work, and hire every one by the year. If any of them are in debt, $100 is my limit of advance money to free them. And hire no man who has no family, for I'm losing confidence every minute in single ones, especially if they are white. We have a few empty jacals, and the more children that I see running naked about the ranch, the better it suits me. I'll never get my money back in building that cotton cottage until I see a mother, even though she is a Mexican, standing in the door with a baby in her arms. The older I get, the more I see my mistake in depending on the white element." I was gone some 3 days in securing the needed help. It was a delicate errand, for no ranchero liked to see people leave his lands, and it was only where I found men unemployed that I applied for and secured them. We sent wagons from Las Palomas after their few effects, and had all the families contentedly housed, either about the headquarters or at the outlying ranchitas, before the first contingent of beeves was gathered. But the attempt to induce any of the new families to occupy the stone cottage proved futile, as they were superstitious. There was a belief among the natives, which no persuasion could remove, regarding houses that were built for others and never occupied. The new building was tendered to Tio Trabucio and his wife, instead of their own palisaded jacal, but it remained tenantless, an eyesore to its builder. Near the latter end of April, a contract was let for 2 new tanks on the Ganso grant of land. Had it not been for the sale of beef, which would require our time the greater portion of the summer, it was my employer's intention to have built these reservoirs with the ranch help. But with the amount of work we had in sight, it was decided to let the contract to parties who made it their business and were outfitted for the purpose. Accordingly, in company with the contractor, Uncle Lance and myself spent the last few days of the month laying off and planning the reservoir sites on 2 small tributaries which formed the Ganso. We were planning to locate these tanks several miles above the juncture of the small rivulets, and as far apart as possible. Then the first rainfall, which would make running water, would assure us a year's supply on the extreme southwestern portion of our range. The contractor had a big outfit of oxen and mules, and the conditions called for one of the reservoirs to be completed before June 15th. Thus, if rains fell when they were expected, one receptacle at least would be in readiness. When returning one evening from starting the work, we found Tony Hunter a guest of the ranch. He had come over for the special purpose of seeing me, but as the matter was not entirely under my control, my employer was brought in to the consultation. In the docket for the May term of court, the divorce proceedings between Esther and Jack Oxenford would come up for a hearing at Oakville on the 7th of the month. Hunter was anxious, if possible, to have all his friends present at the trial, but dates were getting a little close, for our first contingent of beeves was due on the coast on the 20th, and to gather and drive them would require not less than 10 days. A cross bill had been filed by Oxenford's attorney at the last hour, and a fight was going to be made to prevent the decree from issuing. The judge was a holdover from the Reconstruction regime, having secured his appointment through the influence of congressional friends, one of whom was the uncle of the junior stage man. Unless the statutory grounds were clear, There was a doubt expressed by Esther's attorney whether the court would grant the decree. But that was the least of Hunter's fears, for in his eyes the man who would wilfully abuse a woman had no rights, in court or out. Tony, however, had enemies, for he and Oxford had had a personal altercation, and since the separation the Martin family had taken the side of Jack's employer, and severed all connections with the ranch. That the mail contractors had the village of Oakville under their control we all agreed, as we had tested that on our return from Fort Worth the spring before. In all the circumstances, though Hunter had no misgivings as to the ultimate result, yet being a witness and accused of being the main instigator in the case, he felt that he ought, as a matter of precaution, to have a friend or two with him. "Well now, Tony," said my employer, "this is crowding the mourners just a trifle. But Las Palomas was never called on in a good cause but she could lend a man or two, even if they had to get up from the dinner table and go hungry. I don't suppose the trial will last over a day or two at the furthest, and even if it did, the boys could ride home in the night. In our first bunch, and in half a day, we'll gather every beef in 2 rodeos and start that evening. Steamships won't wait, and if we were a day behind time, they might want to hold out demurrage on us. If it wasn't for that, the boys could stay a week, and you would be welcome to them. Of course, Tom will want to go, and about the next best man I could suggest would be June. I'd like the best in the world to go myself, but you see how I'm situated, getting these cattle off and a new tank building at the same time. Now, you boys make your own arrangements among yourselves, and this ranch stands ready to back up anything you say or do." Tony remained overnight, and we made arrangements to meet him either at Shepherd's the evening before or in Oakville on the morning of the trial. Owing to the behavior of Quayle and Cotton, none of us had attended the celebration of San Jacinto Day at the ferry, nor had anyone from the Vox or McLeod ranches, for while they did not understand the situation, it was obvious that something was wrong, and they had remained away, as did Las Palomas. But several of Hunter's friends from the San Miguel had been present, and likewise had Oxenford, and reports came back to the ranch of the latter's conduct and of certain threats he had made when he found there was no one present to resent them. The next morning before starting home, Tony said to our segundo and myself, "Then I'll depend on you two. I may have a few other friends who will want to attend. I don't need very many for a coward like Jack Oxenford. He is perfectly capable of abusing an unprotected woman or an old man if he had a crowd of friends behind him to sick him on. Oh, he's a cur all right, for when I told him that he was whelped under a house, he never resented it. He loves me all right, or has good cause to. Why, I bent the cylinder pin on a new 6-shooter over his head when he had a gun on him, and he forgot to use it. I don't expect any trouble, but if you don't look a sneaking cur right in the eye, he may slip up behind and bite you." After making arrangements to turn in 200 beeves on our second contingent, and send a man with them to the coast, Hunter returned home. There was no special program for the interim until gathering the beeves commenced, yet on a big ranch like Las Palomas there is always work. While Deweese finished curbing the well in which Ortiz had lost his life, I sawed off and cut new threads on all the rods and piping belonging to that particular windmill. With a tireless energy for one of his years, Uncle Lance rode the range until he could have told at a distance one half his holdings of cattle by flesh marks alone. A few days before the date set for the trial, Enrique brought in word one evening that an outfit of strange men were encamped north of the river on the Ganso track. The vaquero was unable to make out their business, but he was satisfied They were not there for pleasure. So my employer and I made an early start the next morning to see who the campers were. On the extreme northwestern corner of our range, fully 25 miles from headquarters, we met them and found they were a corps of engineers running a preliminary survey for a railroad. They were in the employ of the International and Great Northern Company, which was then contemplating extending their line to some point on the Rio Grande. While there was nothing definite in this prior survey, it sounded a note of warning, for the course they were running would carry the line up the Ganso on the south side of the river, passing between the new tanks and leaving our range through a sag in the hills on the south end of the Grant. The engineer in charge very courteously informed my employer that he was under instructions to run from San Antonio to different points on the river 3 separate lines during the present summer. He also informed us that the other 2 preliminary surveys would be run farther west, and there was a possibility that Las Palomas lands would be missed entirely, a prospect that was very gratifying to Uncle Lance. "Tom," said he as we rode away, "I've been dreading this very thing for years. It was my wish that I would never live to see the necessity of fencing our lands, and today a railroad survey is being run across Las Palomas. I had hoped that when I died, this valley would be an open range and as primitive as the day of my coming to it. Here a railroad threatens our peace, and the signs are on every hand that we'll have to fence to protect ourselves. But let it come, for we can't stop it. If I'm spared within the next year, I'll secure every tract of land for sale adjoining the ranch if it costs me $1 an acre. Then if it comes to the pinch, Las Palomas will have for all time land and to spare. You haven't noticed the changes in the country, but nearly all this chaparral has grown up, and the timber is twice as heavy along the river as when I first settled here. I hate the sight even of a necessity like a windmill, and God knows we have no need of a railroad. To a ranch that doesn't sell fat beeves over once in 10 years, transportation is the least of its troubles." About dusk on the evening of the day preceding the trial, June Deweese and I rode into Shepherd's, expecting to remain overnight. Shortly after our arrival, Tony Hunter hastily came in and informed us that he had been unable to get hotel accommodations for his wife and Esther in Oakville, and had it not been that they had old friends in the village, all of them would have had to return to the ferry for the night. These friends of the McLeod family told Hunter that the stage people had coerced the 2 hotels into refusing them, and had otherwise prejudiced the community in Oxenford's favor. Hunter had learned also that the junior member of the stage firm had collected a crowd of hangers-on, and being liberal in the use of money, had convinced the rabble of the village that he was an innocent and injured party. The attorney for Esther had arrived and had cautioned everyone interested on their side of the case to be reserved and careful under every circumstance, as they had a bitter fight on their hands. The next morning all 3 of us rode into the village. Court had been in session over a week, and the sheriff had sworn in several deputies to preserve the peace, as there was considerable bitterness between litigants outside the divorce case. These under-sheriffs made it a point to see that everyone put aside his arms on reaching the town, and tried, as far as lay in their power, to maintain the peace. During the early days of the Reconstruction regime, before opening the term, the presiding judge had frequently called on the state for a company of Texas Rangers to preserve order and enforce the mandates of the court. But in '79 there seemed little occasion for such a display of force, and a few fearless officers were considered sufficient. On reaching the village, we rode to the house where the women were awaiting us. Fortunately, there was ample corral room at the stable, so we were independent of hostelries and liveries. Mrs. Hunter was the very reverse of her husband, being a timid woman, while poor Esther was very nervous under the dread of the coming trial. But we cheered them with our presence, and by the time court opened they had recovered their composure. Our party numbered 4 women and 5 men. Esther lacked several summers of being as old as her sister, while I was by 5 years the youngest of the men, and naturally looked to my elders for leadership. Having left our arms at the house, we entered the courtroom in as decorous and well-behaved manner as if it had been a house of worship and this a Sabbath morning. A peculiar stillness pervaded the room, which could have been mistaken as an omen of peace, or the tension similar to the lull before a battle. Personally I was composed, but as I allowed my eyes from time to time to rest upon Esther, she had never seemed so near and dear to me as in that opening hour of court. She looked very pale, and moved by the subtle power of love, I vowed that should any harm come to or any insulting words be spoken of her, my vengeance would be sure and swift. Court convened, and the case was called. As might have been expected, the judge held that under the pleadings it was not a jury case. The panel was accordingly excused for the day, and joined those curiously inclined in the main body of the room. The complaining witnesses were called, and under direct examination the essential facts were brought forth, laying the foundation for a legal separation. The plaintiff was the last witness to testify. As she told her simple story, a hush fell over the room, every spectator, from the judge on the bench to the sheriff, being eager to catch every syllable of the recital. But as in duty bound to a client, the attorney for the defendant, a young man who had come from San Antonio to conduct the case, opened a sharp cross-questioning. As the examination proceeded, an altercation between the attorneys was prevented only by the presence of the sheriff and deputies. Before the inquiry progressed, the attorney for the plaintiff apologized to the court, pleading extenuating circumstances in the offense offered to his client. Under his teachings, he informed the court, the purity of womanhood was above suspicion, and no man who wished to be acknowledged as a gentleman among his equals would impugn or question the statement of a lady. The witness on the stand was more to him than an ordinary client, as her father and himself had been young men together, had volunteered under the same flag, his friend offering up his life in its defense, and he spared to carry home the news of an unmarked grave on a Southern battlefield. It was a privilege to him to offer his assistance and counsel today to a daughter of an old comrade, and anyone who had the temerity to offer an affront to this witness would be held to a personal account for his conduct. The first day was consumed in taking testimony. The defense introduced much evidence in rebuttal. Without regard to the truth or their oaths, a line of witnesses were introduced who contradicted every essential point of the plaintiff's case. When the credibility of their testimony was attacked, they sought refuge in the technicalities of the law, and were supported by rulings of the presiding judge. When Oxenford took the stand in his own behalf, there was not a dozen persons present who believed the perjured statements which fell from his lips. Yet when his testimony was subjected to rigid cross-questioning, every attempt to reach the truth precipitated a controversy between attorneys as bitter as it was personal. That the defendant at the bar had escaped prosecution for swindling the government out of large sums of money for mail service never performed was well known to every one present, including the judge. Yet he was allowed to testify against the character of a woman pure as a child, while his own past was protected from exposure by rulings from the bench. When the evidence was all in, court adjourned until the following day. That evening our trio, after escorting the women to the home of their friend, visited every drinking resort, hotel, and public house in the village, meeting groups of Oxenford's witnesses, even himself, as he dispensed good cheer to his henchmen. But no one dared to say a discourteous word, and after amusing ourselves by a few games of billiards, we mounted our horses and returned to the Shepherd's for the night. As we rode along leisurely, all three of us admitted misgivings as to the result, for it was clear that the court had favored the defense. Yet we had a belief that the statutory grounds were sufficient, and on that our hopes hung. The next morning found our party in court at the opening hour. The entire forenoon was occupied by the attorney for the plaintiff in reviewing the evidence, analyzing and weighing every particle, showing an insight into human motives which proved him a master in his profession. After the noon recess, the young lawyer from the city addressed the court for 2 hours, his remarks running from bombastic to flights of oratory, and from eulogies upon his client to praise of the unimpeachable credibility of the witnesses for the defense. In concluding, the older lawyer prefaced his remarks by alluding to the divine intent of the institution of marriage, and contending that of the two, women were morally the better. In showing the influence of the stronger upon the weaker sex, he asserted that it was in the power of the man to lift the woman or sink her into despair. In his peroration he rose to the occasion, and amid breathless silence, facing the court, who quailed before him, demanded whether this was a temple of justice. Replying to his own interrogatory, he dipped his brush in the sunshine of life, and sketched a throne with womanhood enshrined upon it. While chivalry existed among men, it mattered little, he said, as to the decree of courts, for in the higher tribunal, human hearts, women, would remain forever in control. At his conclusion, women were hysterical, and men were aroused from their usual languor by the eloquence of the speaker. Had the judge rendered an adverse decision at that moment, he would have needed protection, for to the men of the South it was innate to be chivalrous to womanhood. But the court was cautious, and after announcing that he would take the case under advisement until morning, adjourned for the day. All during the evening men stood about in small groups and discussed the trial. The consensus of opinion was favorable to the plaintiff, but in order to offset public opinion, Oxenford and a squad of his followers made the rounds of the public places, offering to wager any sum of money that the decree would not be granted. Since feeling was running rather high, our little party avoided the other faction, and as we were under the necessity of riding out to the ferry for accommodation, concluded to start earlier than the evening before. After saddling, we rode around the square, and at the invitation of Deweese, dismounted before a public house for a drink and a cigar before starting. We were aware that the town was against us, and to maintain a bold front was a matter of necessity. Unbuckling our belts in compliance with the sheriff's orders, we hung our 6-shooters on the pommels of our saddles and entered the bar-room. Other customers were being waited on, and several minutes passed before we were served. The place was rather crowded, and as we were being waited on, a rabble of roughs surged through the rear door, led by Jack Oxenford. He walked up to within 2 feet of me, where I stood at the counter, and apparently addressing the barkeeper, as we were charging our glasses, said in a defiant tone, "I'll bet $1,000 Judge Thornton refuses to grant a separation between my wife and me." The words flashed through me like an electric shock, and understanding the motive, I turned on the speaker and, with the palm of my hand, dealt him a slap in the face that sent him staggering back into the arms of his friends. Never before or since had I felt the desire to take human life which possessed me at that instant. With no means of defense in my possession but a penknife, I backed away from him, he doing the like, and both keeping close to the bar, which was about 20 feet long. In one hand I gripped the open bladed pocket knife, and with the other behind my back, retreated to my end of the counter, as did Oxenford to his, never taking our eyes off each other. On reaching his end of the bar, I noticed the barkeeper going through the motions that looked like passing him a gun, and in the same instant some friend behind me laid the butt of a pistol in my hand behind my back. Dropping the knife, I shifted the 6-shooter to my right hand, and advancing on the object of my hate, fired in such rapid succession that I was unable to tell whether my fire was being returned. When my gun was empty, the intervening clouds of smoke prevented any view of my adversary, but my lust for his life was only intensified when, on turning to my friends, I saw Deweese supporting Hunter in his arms. Knowing that one or the other had given me the pistol, I begged them for another to finish my work, but at that moment the smoke arose sufficiently to reveal my enemy crippling down at the farther end of the bar, a smoking pistol in his hand. As Oxenford sank to the floor, several of his friends ran to his side, and Deweese, noticing the movement, rallied the wounded man in his arms. Shaking him until his eyes opened, June exultingly, as a savage, cried, "Tony, for God's sake stand up just a moment longer. Yonder he lies. Let me carry you over so you can watch the cur die." Turning to me he continued, "Tom, you got your man. Run for your life. Don't let them get you." Passing out of the house during the excitement, I was in my saddle in an instant, riding like a fiend for Shepherd's. The sun was nearly an hour high, and with a good horse under me, I covered the 10 miles to the ferry in less than an hour. Portions of the route were sheltered by timber along the river, but once, as I crossed a rise opposite a large bend, I sighted a posse in pursuit several miles to the rear. On reaching Shepherd's, fortunately for me, a single horse stood at the hitch rack. The merchant and owner of the horse came to the door as I dashed up, and never offering a word of explanation, I changed horses. Luckily the owner of the horse was Red Ernest, a friend of mine, and feeling that they would not have long to wait for explanations, I shook out the reins and gave him the rowel. I knew the country, and soon left the river road, taking an airline course for Las Palomas, which I reached within 2 hours after nightfall. In a few profane words I explained the situation to my employer, and asked for a horse that would put the Rio Grande behind me before morning. A number were on picket nearby, and several of the boys ran for the best mounts available. A purse was forced into my pocket, well filled with gold. Meanwhile, I had in my possession an extra 6-shooter, and now that I had a moment's time to notice it, recognized the gun as belonging to Tony Hunter. Filling the empty chambers and waving a farewell to my friends, I passed out by the rear and reached the saddle shed where a well-known horse was being saddled by dexterous hands. Once on his back, I soon passed the 80 miles between me and the Rio Grande, which I swam on my horse the next morning within an hour after sunrise. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of A Texas Matchmaker by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sunset. Of my exile of over 2 years in Mexico, little need be said. By easy stages I reached the haciendas on the Rio San Juan, where we had received the cows in the summer of '77. The reception extended me was all one could ask, but cooled when it appeared that my errand was one of refuge and not of business. I concealed my offense and was given employment as corporal segundo over a squad of vaqueros. But while the hacienda to which I was attached was larger than Las Palomas, with greater holdings in livestock, yet my life there was one of penal servitude. I strove to blot out past memories in the innocent pleasures of my associates, mingling in all the social festivities, dancing with the dark-eyed señoritas, and gambling at every fiesta. Yet in the midst of the dissipation there was ever present to my mind the thought of a girl, likewise living a life of loneliness at the mouth of the San Miguel. During my banishment but twice did any word or message reach me from the Nueces Valley. Within a few months after my locating on the Rio San Juan, Enrique Lopez, a trusted vaquero from Las Palomas, came to the hacienda, apparently seeking employment. Recognizing me at a glance, at the first opportunity, he slipped me a letter unsigned and in an unknown hand. After reading it, I breathed easier, for both Hunter and Oxenford had recovered, the former having been shot through the upper lobe of a lung, while the latter having sustained 3 wounds, one of which resulted in the loss of an arm. The judge had reserved his decision until the recovery of both men was assured, but before the final adjournment of court refused the decree. I had had misgivings that this would be the result, and the message warned me to remain away, as the stage company was still offering a reward for my arrest. Enrique loitered around the camp several days, and on being refused employment, made inquiry for a ranch in the south and rode away in the darkness of evening. But we had several little chats together, in which the rascal delivered many oral messages, one of which he swore by all the saints had been entrusted to him by my own sweetheart while visiting at the ranch. But Enrique was capable of enriching any oral message, and I was compelled to read between the lines. Yet I hope the saints to whom he daily prayed will blot out any untruthful embellishments. The second message was given me by Frank Nancrede early in January '81. As was his custom, he was buying saddle horses at Las Palomas during the winter for trail purposes, when he learned of my whereabouts in Mexico. Deweese had given him directions where I could be found, and as the Rio San Juan country was noted for good horses, Nancrede and a companion rode directly from the Nueces Valley to the hacienda where I was employed. They were on the lookout for 1,000 saddle horses, and after buying 200 from the ranch where I was employed, secured my services as interpreter in buying the remainder. We were less than a month in securing the number wanted, and I accompanied the herd to the Rio Grande on its way to Texas. Nancrede offered me every encouragement to leave Mexico, assuring me that Bethel and Oxenford had lost their mail contract between San Antonio and Brownsville, and were now operating in other sections of the state. He was unable to give me the particulars, but frauds had been discovered in star route lines, and the government had revoked nearly all mail contracts in southern Texas. The trail boss promised me a job with any of their herds, and assured me that a cowhand of my abilities would never want a situation in the north. I was anxious to go with him, and would have done so, but felt a compunction which I did not care to broach to him, for I was satisfied that he would not understand. The summer passed, during which I made it a point to meet other drovers from Texas, who were buying horses and cattle. From several sources, the report of Nancrede that the stage line south from San Antonio was now in new hands was confirmed. One drover assured me that a national scandal had grown out of the star route contracts, and several officials in high authority had been arraigned for conspiracy to defraud. He further asserted that the new contractor was now carrying the mail for 10% of what was formerly allowed to Bethel and Oxenford, and making money at the reduced rate. This news was encouraging, and after an exile of over 2 years and a half, I recrossed the Rio Grande on the same horse on which I had entered. Carefully avoiding ranches where I was known, 2 short rides put me in Las Palomas, reaching headquarters after nightfall, where, in seclusion, I spent a restless day and night. A few new faces were about the ranch, but the old friends bade me welcome and assured me that my fears were groundless. During the brief time at my disposal, Miss Jean entertained me with numerous disclosures regarding my old sweetheart. The one that both pleased and interested me was that she was contented and happy, and that her resignation was due to religious faith. According to my hostess's story, a camp meeting had been held at Shepherd's during the fall after my banishment, by a sect calling themselves Predestinarians, and I have since learned that a belief in a predetermined state is entertained by a great many good people, and I admit it seemed as if fate had ordained that Esther McLeod and I should never wed. But it was a great satisfaction to know that she felt resigned and could draw solace from a spiritual source, even though the same was denied to me. During the last meeting between Esther and Miss Jean, but a few weeks before, the former had confessed that there was no hope of our ever marrying. As I had not seen my parents for several years, I continued my journey to my old home on the San Antonio River, leaving Las Palomas after nightfall. I passed the McLeod ranch after midnight, halting my horse to rest. I reviewed the past, and the best reasoning at my command showed nothing encouraging on the horizon. That Esther had sought consolation from a spiritual source did not discourage me, for, under my observation, where it had been put to the test, the love of man and wife overrode it. But to expect this contented girl to renounce her faith and become my wife was expecting her to share with me nothing, unless it was the chance of a felon's cell. And I remounted my horse and rode away under a starry sky, somewhat of a fatalist myself. But I derived contentment from my decision, and on reaching home no one could have told that I had loved and lost. My parents were delighted to see me after my extended absence. My sisters were growing fast into womanhood, and I was bidden the welcome of a prodigal son. During this visit a new avenue in life opened before me, as through the influence of my eldest brother I secured a situation with a drover and followed the cattle trail until the occupation became a lost one. My last visit to Las Palomas was during the winter of 1894-95. It lacked but a few months of 20 years since my advent in the Nueces Valley. After the death of Oxenford by smallpox, I had been a frequent visitor at the ranch, business of one nature and another calling me there. But in this last visit, the wonderful changes which 2 decades had wrought in the country visibly impressed me, and I detected a note of decay in the old ranch. A railroad had been built passing within 10 miles of the western boundary line of the Ganso Grant. The Las Palomas range had been fenced, several large tracts of land having been added after my severing active connections with the ranch. Even the cattle, in spite of all the efforts made for their improvement, were not so good as in the old days of the open range, or before there was a strand of wire between the Nueces and Rio Grande rivers. But the alterations in the country were nothing compared to the changes in my old master and mistress. Uncle Lance was nearing his 82nd birthday, physically feeble, but mentally as active as the first morning of our long acquaintance. Miss Jean, over 20 years the junior of the ranchero, had mellowed into a ripeness consistent with her days, and in all my aimless wanderings I never saw a brother and sister of their ages more devoted to or dependent on each other. On the occasion of this past visit, I was in the employ of a livestock commission firm. A member of our house expected to attend the cattle convention at Fort Worth, in the near future, and I had been sent into the range sections to note the conditions of stock and solicit for my employers. The spring before, our firm had placed 60,000 cattle for customers. Demand continued, and the house had inquiry sufficient to justify them in sending me out to secure, of all ages, not less than 100,000 steer cattle. And thus once more I found myself a guest of Las Palomas. "Don't talk cattle to me," said Uncle Lance, when I mentioned my business. "Go to June. He'll give you the ages and numbers. And whatever you do, Tom, don't oversell us, for wire fences have cut us off till it seems like old friends don't want to neighbor any more. In the days of the open range I used to sell every hoof I had a chance to, but since then things have changed. Why, only last year a jury indicted a young man below here on the river for mavericking a yearling and sent him to Huntsville for 5 years. That's a fair sample of these modern days. There isn't a cowman in Texas today who amounts to a pinch of snuff but got his start the same way. But if a poor fellow looks out of the corner of his eye now at a critter, they imagine he wants to steal it. Oh, I know them, and the bigger rustlers they were themselves on the open range, the bitterer their persecution of the man who follows their example." June Deweese was then the active manager of the ranch, and after securing a classification of their saleable stock, I made out a memorandum and secured authority in writing to sell their holdings at prevailing prices for Nueces River cattle. The remainder of the day was spent with my old friends in a social visit, and as we delved into the musty past, the old man's love of the land and his matchmaking instincts constantly cropped out. "Tom," said he, in answer to a remark of mine, "I was an awful fool to think my experience could be of any use to you boys. Every last rascal of you went off on the trail and left me here with a big ranch to handle. Gallup was no better than the rest, for he kept Julie Wilson waiting until now she's an old maid. Sis here always called Scales a vagabond, but I still believe something could have been made of him with a little encouragement. But when the exodus of the cattle to the north was at its height, he went off with a trail herd just like the rest of you. Then he followed the trail town as a gambler, saved money, and after the cattle driving ended, married an adventuress, and that's the end of him. The lack of a market was one of the great drawbacks to ranching, but when the trail took every hoof we could breed and every horse we could spare, it also took my boys. Tom, when you get old, you'll understand that all is vanity and vexation of spirit. But I'm perfectly resigned now. In my will, Las Palomas and everything I have goes to Jean. She can dispose of it as she sees fit, and if I knew she was going to leave it to Father Norquin or his successor, my finger wouldn't be raised to stop it. I spent a lifetime of hard work acquiring this land, and now there is no one to care for the old ranch. I wash my hands of it." Knowing the lifetime of self-sacrifice in securing the land of Las Palomas, I sympathized with the old ranchero in his despondency. "I never blamed you much, Tom," he resumed after a silence, "but there's something about cattle life which I can't explain. It seems to disqualify a man for ever making a good citizen afterward. He roams and runs around, wasting his youth, and gets so foxy he never marries." "But June and the widow made the rifle finally," I protested. "Yes, they did, and that's something to the good, but they never had any children. Waited 10 years after Anira was killed, and then got married. That was one of Jean's matches. Tom, you must go over and see Juana before you go. There's a match that I made. Just think of it. They have 8 children, and Fidel is prouder over them than I ever was over this ranch. The natives have never disappointed me, but the Caucasians seem to be played out." I remained overnight at the ranch. After supper, sitting in his chair before a cheerful fire, Uncle Lance dozed off to sleep, leaving his sister and myself to entertain each other. I had little to say of my past, and the future was not encouraging, except there was always work to do. But Miss Jean unfolded like the pages of an absorbing chronicle, and gave me the history of my old acquaintances in the valley. Only a few of the girls had married. Frances Vaux, after flirting away her youth, had taken the veil in one of the orders in her church. My old sweetheart was contentedly living a life of seclusion on the ranch on which she was born, apparently happy, but still interested in any word of me and my wanderings. The young men of my acquaintance, except where married, were scattered wide, the whereabouts of nearly all of them unknown. Tony Hunter had held the McLeod estate together, and it had prospered exceedingly under his management. My old friend, Red Earnest, who outrode me in the relay race at the tournament in June '77, was married and serving in the customs service on the Rio Grande as a mounted river guard. The next morning I made the round of the Mexican quarters, greeting my old friends before taking my leave and starting for the railroad. The cottage which had been built for Esther and me stood vacant and windowless, being used only for a storehouse for zacahuiste. As I rode away, the sight oppressed me. It brought back the June time of my life, even the hour and instant in which our paths separated. On reaching the last swell of ground, several miles from the ranch, which would give me a glimpse of headquarters, I halted my horse in a farewell view. The sleepy old ranch cozily nested among the encinal oaks revived 100 memories, some sad, some happy, many of which have returned in retrospect during lonely hours since. End of chapter 22. End of A Texas Matchmaker by Andy Adams. Recording by Richard Kilmer, San Antonio, Texas.